Chair. Let's open up the floor to questions. And then Gerhard, let's take 3 at a time. Do we want more? Don't leave it to me. Okay.
Sorry.
Great, thank you.
So my question is for Etienne. Really interesting paper as usual. I would like to know what is the role of ideas to counter neoliberal discourse by trade unions in the US? Because there's this thesis that Période, for instance, just put as a book that the political articulation of the system in the US was actually against labor unions compared to Canada. And I want to know if those ideas that exploded in the 70s that take roots from 50s and 60s as some kind of link between the fact that labor in the US is less powerful than other places, so how they can, because of power resources, as Corby will say, because class balances is toward more the capitalist class instead of labor unions. I'd like to hear you about this.
Okay.
I have a question to Marco and Glenn. I think it's very important to look at the national knowledge systems. If you take the case of Germany, the model change in 2003 was prepared by changing knowledge system, because suddenly private think tanks came in. The employers supported a new initiative, new social market economy with 100 million euro, and the Bertelsmann Foundation organized conferences, think tanks, studies, etc. So it was a really break with the former, let's say, more democratic model with publicly financed research institutes. And I think this model change for this year was closely linked with this, and I think we can generalize it, because the knowledge systems, if they are democratic, pluralistic, they would not allow a pure deregulation like we had in Germany from 1990 to 2003.
We're just going to use the microphone, everybody, because we want to capture what's happening in the room. Yeah, thank you.
For Marco and Glenn, I wonder if you could just comment on if ideas have been a more powerful mechanism for changing one of your case studies versus another, and if so, why is that?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't quite get.
I was just asking if in one of the case studies you've looked at, if ideas have been a more powerful mechanism for change or for shaping institutions and employment relations, and if so, why is that?
Okay, let's take, that's 3 questions on the floor. Let's get through that. I feel like this could be a full half-day session. So let's get going.
Yeah, I start with Gerhard. I mean, there's evidence on the new social market economy and the think tank there. There's a paper by Kinderman, and we looked at the available evidence, and so far we didn't see it as absolutely decisive. But I mean, following your comments there, we will absolutely look again at the evidence there and see and try to evaluate how they possibly push certain ideas into the agenda and how they influence possibly the Hartz agenda. So I take that on board, and we just look at that piece of evidence again. And
I think it would be very convenient for us if what you said, if we went with what you said, and the first versions, I think we were sort of saying, well, look, you can see these changes in think tanks, and that's feeding into Hartz. But when Marco looked in more detail, he didn't feel that there was a strong link in terms of the process of coming up with the Hartz reforms and these private think tanks. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, when I looked at the reforms, there was still a very strong link in the political sphere between the Chancellery and the Labour Ministry and the Hartz reform, and they didn't appear to kind of influence that policy making, but happy to look at that evidence again. Daniel asked about really what really is a driver across the cases, what explains the change. First of all, what we do here is really kind of a look and feel and contextualize comparison. So we have on the dependent variable, we don't keep it constant. We rather look at the most salient policy issues in the respective countries and then try to explain those, right? And then we have really kind of a set of structural factors that come into play, and maybe to just fill in a couple of more details there. In the United States, very important, you have a lot of political appointments. And so really there's no continuity in terms of the bureaucracy, which could kind of provide also continuity in terms of policy making. You have that in Germany, and very few positions are only really political, and you have career administrators, bureaucrats who kind of have keep a certain legacy of policy making going, and others would be really kind of the role of think tanks, which is absolutely outsized in the United States and directly relate to the political process. As you don't have a continuity in governance following a presidential direct election, you have then really they're coming in as idea maker, as idea providers. They're coming in with blueprints for governance. At the same time, the favorite government think tanks or of the winning party, they get completely hired into government and then shape the political agenda there. And you have then a very outsized role, and you wouldn't have these type of dramatic changes following a policy change, right? And in Germany, very important, that's another little detail, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party have a worker group and who represent worker interests there. So even if there's a switch in government from one party to another, you have still a government party representing worker interest, right? And so it leads also to less a polarized landscape. And then maybe one last point, really, if you compare across the cases and what really matters more. In the United States, the influence of money in shaping policy ideas is absolutely outsized, right? And in Germany, it's quite limited. And now, really, the last point: what counts as really as academic evidence and how it is judged and looked at. So you have really these public and semi-public research institute, and if they would really come up with unfounded academic ideas and really bend their data and have major flaws there, they would lose their funding. And in the United States, these think tanks, they changed the rules of the game, pushed the academic research institute to the side, and then really advance a partisan policies idea. So you have a very different social production of ideas across these two countries.
Yeah, really briefly on Matthew's question, which was one. The role of ideas played in shaping the polity in the US and how that made for a state, that's more antagonistic towards labor. Yeah, okay. I mentioned a couple of fields of literature that have been in renewal, and in labor history or political history in the last 2 decades, since the mid-90s, the research on conservatism has exploded. It had been neglected. State theory had been developed by theorists trying to explain the relative autonomy of the state from business forces during the construction of liberal regimes or liberal reform, progressive reform. New Deal, Great Society, moments like that, and moments of conservative reform when the state's supposed to be cozier or closer to business interests that have been largely neglected. Over the last few years, there's been work by Kimberly Phillips-Fein, Schirmer, Lichtenstein on the rise of the right from the 50s on, and their attacks on labor and all that. And basically, there's a new renewal of political history around the conservative movement, the Republican Party, but also organizations like Americans for Tax Reform, Club for Growth, the Koch Network, and peak business organizations and their role in politics. So I agree with Marco that the way he describes the US, and that might be particular, but I feel on good grounds. with this literature. I invite you to look at in the paper on the section on the 70s in particular, when ideas against public sector unionism and public sector collective bargaining arose. Sylvester Petrol, libertarian jurists, were taken out of mothballs. Literally, they were basically on the margins of political discourse. But during the stagflation crisis with mounting deficits, basically these off-the-chart libertarian ideas were taken to the center and marched in the political mainstream with Reagan when he took control of the White House. So ideas that were very peripheral became important suddenly in the 70s, and it's these turning points or junctures that I look at. Stagflation crisis in the 70s, the 2007-2008 crisis was also a brief moment of debate between Keynesian notions and neoliberal authoritarian views. I think organized labor was beaten badly during that debate because the whole ideological edifice had been tilting against Keynesian notions since at least the late 60s, early 70s. There would need to be a kind of a post-Keynesian renewal of ideas within the labor movement, I think, and platform to counter that again, like it's been done in the 30s and 40s, but far from that now.
Wow, another 2 sets of fantastic papers. I'm going to take advantage of my privilege as chair and just make a few comments before we open it up to the floor. I think this has been a really intellectually and unsurprisingly politically important panel to have today, and thank you all for contributing. I think one of the themes that underpins what all of you are talking about is a crisis of the political imagination, and how important it is to really focus on the ways in which the scope of ideas that enter into and are rejected from our political landscape are both historically instructive, how did we get here, right? And instructive in terms of how we imagine what a better future might look like. Glenn and Marco, I'd be very keen to hear from you about what theoretical tools you're using to make sense of the work that you're doing. There's a big literature on policy networks, Marsh and Smith, and Kisby in particular, who talks about the role of ideas in shaping public policy. That I think is helpful, that builds on the idea of policy as a dialectic, which I think needs to be even further complicated given the current political context. What I really liked about this session is evidence-based policymaking is a lovely idea. It is almost never taken up, right? For any of us who study or work in the policy space, it's often written on the back of a napkin, right? And political opportunity, let's push this idea through here. So it makes me think that we have to, Marco, you raised the question of, where's the academic evidence on this? And there's some new research that evidence is, and I think we're living this at the moment, that good ideas and good evidence very rarely get translated into public policy, which then begs the question of, well, how does it get made? On the backs of what ideas? I think an important thing for us to think about in the framing of this, and Etienne, you touched on this, is in fact that really important ideological shift from Keynesianism, right, to neoliberalism, and what were the ideas that underpinned Hayek, Friedman? How did those fundamentally libertarian ideas take over the global consensus about what should the state be doing and for whom? And everybody picked on that today. John, you raised something that I think is really interesting that made me reflect on my own work, was you talked about unions and their unwillingness to engage in contentious politics, right? And my work looks at gender equity and #MeToo, and this is a very contentious space for unions to be in, and I hear lots of the same things internal and between the unions, which makes me beg the question, well, whose norm is the default setting? Somebody's going to be pissed off. So lots of people have already been pissed off for a long time. It's just that different voices and ideas are asking for traction now. So is it possible that the default setting, right, those members, or we might piss off those members, right? Well, maybe is keeping those members happy how we got into this problem in the first place? Do we have to fundamentally rethink union politics altogether? And I also like the idea that everyone here talked about the idea that influence is very different than traction in the policy sphere, and there's a centering indeed of power relations, which is critical. And then Stephen and Miguel, obviously you raised some really critical issues. So we start at the macro with Glenn and Marco, and we end up in a very concrete paper that talks about the privatization of public policy and the commercialization of regulation. And what I loved about that was not just the fragmentation of the regulatory regimes and the complicatedness of that as a consequence of the various ideas and decisions of the state, what is the state doing? But more importantly, perhaps, or equally important, is the dilemmas that this poses for workers themselves on the shop floor, the moral, conscientious, social dilemmas. And then how does that then play out to loop it back into the macro that then manifests as xenophobia, anti-immigration, racism, and that has really fractious implications for our socio-political landscape, which I think, John, you're quite right, is we're in, what the fuck do we do? We're in deep shit. Okay, so, thank you. This is so rich. That's enough for me. I'd like to now open it up. We have a few minutes. We have about 10 minutes left for questions from the floor. Yeah. Okay. We'll do, Pete, and then at the back. Do we have a mic? Can we get a mic on this side of the room?
No.
Share? I can get up and move. I'll move. I'll play Oprah. It's fine. Reach under your seats.
Thanks. I'd just like ask Miguel and Stephen whether some of this is being influenced by the demand for different types of inspection.
Yeah.
So for example, you have the figures of these agencies and what they're responsible for, and clearly some have got no money, no inspectors. But is it the case that because they don't hit the news, nobody's interested in it? And one of the things about that, enterprise reform thing in 2013 was the responsibility the employers previously had for protecting employees against sexual harassment from third parties, from their customers, for example. And there was a previous 3 strikes and you're out rule that, nobody's using that, so we'll get rid of it. Which now looks a bit out, misplaced in terms of the consumer movement and policy and things like that. But is there a sense that a lot of this is just being driven by what the demand is for health inspection, safety inspection, or other things? Or is that part of the equation and the justification for doing some of the things that you've been talking about in terms of how these organisations are being resourced and underfunded and all those kind of things?
Correct. Okay, you have a question at the corner. And then we'll take one more from Nick in the corner.
Hi. This question I think is for Etienne, but I think all of you have something to say about it. I guess, Etienne, I'm interested in how you think about the state in capitalism, because I heard from your presentation discussion of deregulation in an era when the state has innovated in regulation globally and done a whole lot to regulate, that is to build up a structure to enable global flows of finance. And more particularly in your presentation when you were talking about the crises, maybe one way of getting at the state's role might be to think about how crises for capital end up being passed on to crises for workers, because I think in each of the cases that you were describing from the 70s on were really shifts from the 70s, from shifting global flows of finance back to Wall Street, and others had similar dynamics of firms facing profit crises, states intervening to really turn those into crises for working class people. So I'd just be curious to hear you speak a little bit more about how you think about the state, and whether this era is fundamentally new, or if the newness was more the Keynesian era, and the state is more aggressively working on behalf of or intertangled with capital now.
Okay, one more question from Meg in the corner, and then we'll open it up to our
Thanks. It's a question back to Stephen and Miguel. I thought it was a really interesting compact paper and a comment really that I have. I thought what you describe in terms of labour inspection, I wonder whether you agree with that, happens in parallel to a rise of private forms of inspection. So there's a lot of large companies that cry out for more inspection because basically what they do is either employ directly or through third-party auditors, employ a lot of social auditors, which in contrast to financial auditors are completely unregulated. So that should kind of make you think in a sense of what's happening there. So these people go on quality control inspections, on raids, on stakeouts. To some extent, they're after the same things as the border police. And in terms of the labour process, I think it's interesting that what you described, I thought that was a really interesting aspect. A lot of these things are replicated. So ethical trade managers are not only driven by sort of the right kind of values, let's say, but then because of their labour process, the way they're implicated in what they're supposed to do, i.e. risk management for brands, end up essentially as border police, which they also find very, very difficult.
Great, thanks. I just want to make sure we have enough time for discussion. All right, responses, I leave it to you for our last 10 minutes.
Okay. I can address, yeah.
Yeah, okay, no.
Yeah, I'll address the next point.
Yeah,
Maybe if you
okay,
want to
Peter's.
Peter's. Yeah, Nick, just to start with your point, what you've had in a lot of these sorts of agencies is really since 2008 and before that in some cases is below inflation pay rises year on year for the best part of a decade now. So unsurprisingly you've got these kind of incredibly knowledgeable people taking those sorts of jobs in the private sector. So with things like the regulations on modern slavery and having to sort of declare if you're a company over a certain size that you have audited your supply chain to ensure there's no forced labour in it, that has created a kind of a growth industry in many respects, particularly in food and agriculture and so on. So there are things happening in parallel, but as you say, they are completely unregulated really, and often will, it's often a paper exercise really rather than being able to sort of delve into whether there really are kind of labour standards abuses taking place within the supply chain. So it's a curious kind of dichotomy between the kind of like privatised, marketised sort of element of regulation and the sort of more residual sort of aspect of the state in terms of what it does. In terms of, I'll just mention something in terms of Peter's point as well on different types of inspection and demand for it and so forth. I think the Health and Safety Executive, just as an example, has had its funding levels cut quite dramatically over the last 8 years. It's had its number of inspectors really, really seriously reduced as well. But we know that workplace-related illnesses, accidents to a certain extent certainly aren't decreasing. They are, tens of thousands of people per year are kind of contracting diseases, which are a direct consequence of their employment. So that's all very much still a live issue, and we've had the resources cut sort of in spite of that. But I think there is a kind of more of a political discourse that nobody works in factories or on building sites anymore. Where it's always everybody's like in your presentation earlier. From a Taylor review, it's just white people sitting around laptops talking about things. And there's that kind of political assumption that you don't need these forms of regulation and kind of more dangerous forms of work.
I'll come in quickly, so John is. Yeah. I think the thing about Britain, I think Etienne's presentation is important, and some of Stephen's other work on the the new right before the new right in Britain and all the other think tanks and blacklisting, which is a big issue, is that there is a fragmentation of how you have to enforce things because of new agencies and new kind of structures in the labour market. But the truth is there's been an ideological assault on health and safety in Britain systematically since the 70s, which in a sense is parallel to the assault on the equality discourse, right? So this has been systematic, it's been embedded, it's been in the press, the whole anti-political correct thing. And so as a consequence of that, I think that sometimes has fed into the policy making, and in terms of grayling and some aspects of the policy making in the early 10 years ago, that was clearly the case.
Amanda has hit the nail on the head. I think there is a crisis of political imagination, and but it's not necessarily problems of imagination. It's the problems of having the organizational power and the resources and the wherewithal to make that imagination a reality. And I think that's where we're at. Is how can we, if you go to Porto Alegre, right, and there are thousands of people with all kinds of great ideas. You look at the environmental movement today, there are brilliant people who are talking about how we can get to a degrowth future. You talk to labor activists and some of the people who were involved in the Fight for 15 campaign in Ontario, and they were brilliant in terms of trying to bring people together and hold great meetings. That's great. Problem is that in terms of the fight, the long-term social democratic thing was that people always had numbers, whereas business just had money. And supposedly, in the social democratic ideal, you could use those numbers to beat back money. That's not happening now. Right? And if you just think about where we are, and I love this place, and I come here and I want to kiss Christian's feet when I come here because I'm so grateful I come to such a beautiful place, right? This business school is cranking out 500,000 graduates a year. Labor studies in my little institution does 2. If we're not able to leverage our smart and to talk about how we can suddenly turn our imagination into reality for each of those 2 people, we are fighting a losing war. So thinking about us, I know this might be a strange thing for some of you, right? But you are the organic intellectuals. You are people who are talking about labor. You are talking about work. You are talking about the problems working people face. So we can't just think about bargaining. We can't just think about campaigns. We also have to start thinking about politics and the challenges and how we can build solidarity.
Well, on that note, are we okay? It's lunchtime. Does everybody who works at a business school feel like they should resign? And since the global decline, okay. So job market, can we do a job fair next year? Listen, join please.